Pebble Hill Plantation, steeped in the culture and tradition of South Georgia, is a home rich in both art and history. The overall impression one receives from this remarkable estate is more felt than defined. This area that came to be known as Southwest Georgia was a wilderness of tall pines and red hills in the early 1820s. Pebble Hill's history is divided between two families and eras: the Johnson-Mitchell family during the 19th century and the Hanna family during the 20th century. Thomas Jefferson Johnson, one of the first of the settlers to come to this strange frontier, was an enterprising young man. He acquired the initial Pebble Hill acreage in 1825 and built the first house on the property in 1827. Like most plantations in the region at that time, Pebble Hill was worked by enslaved peoples. The 1830 census recorded 21 enslaved peoples at Pebble Hill. The Johnsons grew crops such as cotton, sugarcane, corn, and tobacco. Johnson and his first wife had 3 children, but only one survived to adulthood. Following Johnson's death in 1847 and his second wife's death in 1850, his daughter Julia Ann inherited Pebble Hill at 21 years of age. She married John William Henry Mitchell in 1849, and together they continued to operate Pebble Hill as a successful agricultural site. In 1850, they replaced the original residence with one designed by English architect John Wynd. When Mitchell died in 1865, the strong-willed Julia Ann determined to continue the farming operations on Pebble Hill. She struggled in the throes of post-war depression and died in 1881. Not surprisingly, by this time Pebble Hill was in a serious state of disrepair. Today, none of the buildings from the Johnson-Mitchell era still exist. Around the same time in the late 1880s, Thomasville was enjoying popularity as a major winter resort. Thousands of wealthy Northerners were coming by private rail car to spend the winter months in this little South Georgia community. Visitors were attracted to the area for its good climate, abundant quail hunting, and accessibility by rail. Thomasville was progressive in its thinking and built large hotels to accommodate the winter visitors. While many of these visitors stayed in the hotels, many others purchased available properties. Plantations that had been working farms were sold to Northerners as winter estates, and Thomasville's history was changed forever. The plantations were saved and repurposed. The community benefited greatly from this transition socially, culturally, and economically. The second era in Pebble Hill's history began in 1896, when Pebble Hill sold to Howard Melville Hanna of Cleveland, Ohio. He gave the Pebble Hill property to his daughter, Kate Hanna Ireland, in 1901. Kate was married twice. Her first husband, with whom she had 2 children, was Robert Livingston Ireland. Their children were Robert Livingston, Liv, Ireland Jr., and Elizabeth Pansy Ireland. Her second marriage was in 1923 to Perry Williams Harvey. Kate Harvey was mistress of Pebble Hill until her death in 1936. She made major improvements on the plantation, expanded the acreage for hunting, and filled the house with guests throughout each winter season. To run her estate, Mrs. Harvey employed approximately 100 men and women. More than half were African American. Most were hired locally, and others traveled with the family from their home in Cleveland. Mrs. Harvey hired skilled men for workers as carpenters, blacksmiths, dairymen, and chauffeurs. Women were employed as maids, cooks, laundresses, and teachers. Most of the present-day buildings designed by Abram Garfield were constructed during the time that Mrs. Harvey owned the property. The first structure she had built was the Log Cabin School, built in 1901. This school is where her 2 children and children of her guests were tutored. Today, this is the oldest building on the property. Mrs. Harvey started the Pebble Hill Jersey herd in 1920 and developed it into one of the finest award-winning herds in the country. The cow barn, patterned after the architecture of the University of Virginia, was built in 1928 to accommodate the Jerseys. Tragedy struck in 1934. When the 1850 portion of the main house was destroyed by fire. The loggia wing, added in 1914, was saved from the fire and was included in the plans for the new house. The new house, with over 40 rooms, was constructed in the following 18 months and was completed in January of 1936. Kate Harvey died in May of 1936, and her daughter Pansy became Pebble Hill's mistress. Pansy preserved what her mother had created and enjoyed Pebble Hill as her main residence. She also made Pebble Hill her own by shifting the focus from the Jersey herd in favor of horses and converting most of the cow barn complex into stables. Pansy was married in 1946 to Parker Poe. She did not have children of her own, but she did have children of the four-legged variety, horses and dogs. A great animal lover and an inveterate collector, Mrs. Poe amassed numerous collections that all point to her passion for the sporting life. She loved spending time outdoors, whether on a quail hunt, turkey drive, or picnicking in the woods. She was an accomplished horsewoman and became one of the country's first female polo players. Like her mother, Mrs. Poe was a very generous person. She was deeply involved in the community, giving funding, land, and buildings for various noteworthy causes. And like her mother, she was a gracious hostess and entertained regularly at Pebble Hill. Many of her mother's guests continued to be invited to the plantation during Mrs. Poe's tenure. President Dwight Eisenhower and Mrs. Eisenhower were guests on several occasions. President Jimmy Carter was an overnight guest when he was governor of Georgia. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were among other notable visitors. Both mother and daughter recognized the importance of the staff in the day-to-day operations of Pebble Hill. Most staff members and their families lived on-site in apartments, duplexes, or houses built during the early 1900s. A school was established on Pebble Hill for the employees' children, and Mrs. Poe funded the college education for several of these children. The family planned 2 elaborate celebrations each year to honor the staff. Weeks of preparation went into the Christmas party for the employees and their families at Piney Grove Church. Mrs. Harvey, Mrs. Poe, and their house guests enjoyed distributing gifts to everyone in attendance. The Pebble Hill staff and their families, along with those neighboring plantations, enjoyed a day of fun on the grounds of Pebble Hill at Easter. An elaborate picnic lunch, egg hunt, games, and singing highlighted the celebration, which topped 1,500 people in attendance one year. In the 1950s, Mrs. Poe established the Pebble Hill Foundation, a private nonprofit foundation which she endowed. At her death in 1978, her will dictated that the Pebble Hill property would go to the foundation and that Pebble Hill would become a museum open to the public. Her desire was to share the Pebble Hill she loved so dearly and to preserve it as a tangible glimpse into the 20th century lifestyle that her family once enjoyed. Pebble Hill was first opened as a museum in October of 1983. Visitors come from around the world to marvel at the wonderful main house, furnished entirely with Hanna family furnishings, to be amazed at the stately architecture, and to see the collection of vintage carriages, and to enjoy the serenity of the beautiful grounds. Pebble Hill maintains 3,000 acres, 72 of which are open for the public to explore. Pebble Hill is listed in the National Register of Historic Places and has graced the cover of numerous publications, including the official travel guide for the state of Georgia. Located in Thomasville, Georgia's backyard, this plantation, with all of its grace and beauty, is a Southern treasure. Although steeped in history, Pebble Hill Plantation is ever vibrant through its programming and various activities of today. Come and enjoy all that Pebble Hill has to offer.